Hello students, today we are going to talk about a topic in general psychology, distortions in perception. The main objectives of this particular lesson are to explain the various distortions in perception. Then we are also going to discuss illusions and hallucinations. Then to describe extrasensory perception. Distortions in perception. Before we go deep into distortions we experience in perception, let us see how perception works. Perception is an important aspect of life and many problems of perceptual organization may be traced to this distortion in perception. Perception means, as you know, it is the ability to perceive, understand or mental grasp of qualities by means of senses or awareness. Communication is influenced by one's perception of individual, and when we communicate with someone, the language we use, the tone of the language and gesture we make portray an individual's character and a kind of relationship he or she wants to develop. According to Stephen Robbins, it is a process by which individuals organize and interpret their sensory impressions in order to give meaning to their environment. People's behavior is determined by their perception. Perception consists of several processes which are influenced by the circumstances and the perceiver himself. In the words of Joseph Reitz, all those processes by which an individual receives information about his environment such as seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting and smell. Perception varies from person to person and situation to situation and from time to time. Individuals listening to the same thing may perceive it differently, and in the same manner individuals looking at the same thing may perceive it in various ways or different ways. The perceptual process consists of the following steps. The first one is stimuli or a cue. Every human being has 5 sensory organs, namely vision, hearing, touch, smell and taste. Stimuli or cues are received by these organs. The next one is selection of that stimuli or cue. Many types and kinds of cues or stimuli are received, but only selected stimuli gets interpreted or perceived. The next is filling up the gaps. Perceiver will try to fill up the gaps or complete the missing links in the information by supplementing it with relevant information, and perceiver makes necessary efforts to maintain continuity in the information. The next is proximity. It means nearness or closeness of information which may be perceived as a whole, and should be noted here that the proximity is different than the similarity. Now, as we have already discussed perception, which is the way in which we tend to again organize the information and get the whole picture of sensory organization, but sometimes there might be misinterpretation or distortions of sensory information. The lack of correspondence between the way a stimulus is generally perceived and the way an individual perceives in a given conditions are called as distortions in perception. Distortions in perception results in creating communication gap, and it is a serious barrier to communication, and it is also the reason for the communication failure. Joseph Reitz has rightly pointed out that communication may fail because the communicator perceptually is ready to receive certain communication which actually receives different communication. Professor Ashwatthappa observed that a common phenomenon in communication is the tendency for a receiver to evaluate information on basis of its source. The person's personality, his values, needs and attitudes and the environment in the organization, etc., does influence the perception. The information which is collected in terms of visual sense is processed in the brain to give a perception which does not exactly match with a physical measurement of the stimulus source, such as the kind of false interpretation. We usually call this particular false interpretation as illusion. And there is no mental status examination which is complete without a statement relating to the abnormalities or perception. According to Fish, Perceptual abnormalities may be classified as either sensory distortions or sensory deceptions, such as illusions and hallucinations. It is also that we mostly rely on our vision and we are particularly susceptible to its deceptions. This deception originates from an inherent characteristic or vision, and we do not directly perceive the physical features of light, but rather we experience the interpretative mental symbol of the object. Formulating a theory about what happens between light and perception has challenged many scientists for hundreds of years, and the earliest conundrum involved the Kepler's theory of the retinal image as an inverted picture. Kepler was convinced of this aspect of the optics, but he could not explain how the retinal image is flipped, so that we do not perceive an upside down world. It can also be said that color and shape constancies are also examples of perceptual processes that distort the world in a way that makes it very easy to understand. They allow us to gain access not to raw physical information about light, but rather to more indirect and meaningful representations. These representations are based on relationships rather than properties of isolated objects, and for most people this type of information is useful and expected. Now let us see some of the distortions in perceptions. One of the type of distortion in perception are the illusions, which we experience in our day-to-day life. Perceptions sometimes provide false interpretations of sensory information. These false interpretation, we call it as illusions. The term was used by psychologists to refer to incorrect perceptions. There are two types of illusions, that ones which are due to physical processes and those due to cognitive processes. Illusions due to distortions in of physical condition include mirages, in which you perceive things that are not real, and there such as the water you often seem to see on the dry road ahead of you. Our focus will be on the later type of illusion, those which involve cognitive processes. Illusion exploit the dichotomy between the objective reality and subjective perception. Visual illusions, when once viewed as devil's mischief, have been around for centuries. Illusions often illustrate the flaws of perception, but more often they rely on normal perceptual functions applied to unusual situations. A discussion on common illusions and their relevance to everyday vision can help us to better understand the relationship of perception and the visual world, and it can further emphasize the nature of perception as an instrument of transmogrification rather than direct measurement. An illusion can also be understood as a distortion in senses, but visual illusions or optical illusions are best known and understood. The emphasis on visual illusions occurs because of 10 dominates other senses. For example, individuals watching a ventriloquist will perceive the voice is coming from the dummy, since they are able to see the dummy mouth the words, whereas some illusions are based on general assumptions the brain makes during the perception. These assumptions are made using organizational principles and individuals' capacity for depth perception and motion perception and perceptual constancy. Other illusions occur because of biological sensory structures within the human body or conditions outside the body with one's physical environment. There are many illusions relating to the cognitive processes which exist, but most of them fall into categories such as illusions of size, illusions of shape, etc. The theory of misapplied constancy suggests that when looking at illusions, we interpret certain cues as suggesting that some parts are farther away than others, and the tendency towards the size constancy themes into play without we perceptually distort the length of various lines. In these kinds of situations, the learning plays an important role, such as the Muller-Lyer illusion. Coming to Muller-Lyer illusion, it is named after its creator Franz Karl Muller-Lyer. It is one among a number of illusions where a central aspect of a simple line image such as length, straightness or parallelism of lines appears distorted in virtue of other aspects to the image. These are sometimes called geometrical optical illusions. This is an example of Muller-Lyer illusion, where you see two lines which are actually equal in size, but when you perceive it with your bare eyes, you tend to perceive one line as longer and one line as shorter, and it is because of the particular edges how it is curved. So, as we have already discussed this Muller-Lyer illusion, how we tend to perceive it, this particular picture demonstrates that. The first one is misapplied size constancy scaling. The arrowheads engage the part of visual system that deals with depth cues in retinal images, which results in the line with the outward pointing arrowheads being perceived as longer because it is processed as being farther away. Next is conflicting cues. The arrowheads are perceived as contributing to the length of the lines, and the long shape of the line with the outward pointing arrowheads. Next is confusion. The intertip distance between the relevant arrowheads influences perceived length. Another type of illusion is that of shape or areas. We often wonder that the moon looks bigger at the horizon, that is almost 30 times of it, and that than it's the highest point in the sky. Then you might be familiar with the most famous area illusion called as moon illusion. This particular type of illusion is an optical illusion which causes the moon to appear larger near the horizon than it does higher in the sky. It happens because when moon is near the horizon, we can see that it is farther away than trees, houses and other objects. Like illusions of size, area, shape illusions can influence perception, sometimes producing some unsettling consequences, for example, which involves Poggendorff illusion. In this particular illusion, a line disappears at an angle behind a solid figure. It involves the brain's perception of interaction between diagonal lines and horizontal and vertical edges. Another illusion, we call it as illusion of movement, which is also known as pi phenomenon. Where perceiving movement is one of the characteristics of perception, it is an innate nature of human vision through perceiving movement, which is also a natural perceiving apparent movement of an object, which is also known as illusion of movement or pi phenomenon. Illusions are not limited to visual processes. Instead, there are many examples of illusions for our other sensory modalities. One of the well known illusions that you can demonstrate yourself is that of touch temperature. Figure showing illusions for other sensory modalities. First, place one hand in a container of hot water and other hand in cold water. Then place both hands in a container of lukewarm water. What do you feel? Most people experience a dramatic difference in perceived temperature between the two hands. The hand which was not initially placed in hot water feels the lukewarm water as cool, whereas the hand initially placed in cold water feels it as hot. Hence, when we touch an object, the temperature of the area or skin which is in contact with it shifts towards that of the object surface. And when we perceive an object to be warm or cool, our experience seems or stems partly for that temperature difference between the object and our skin, not solely is from the actual temperature of the object. And some of the causes of these kind of illusions could be, the first one is similarity. If two objects are similar in appearance, the illusion occurs more easily than others. For example, it is natural to mistake a curled rope for a snake. The next is expectancy. If we are waiting for a friend, every individual at a distance will be mistaken for your friend. While searching for a lost can, every glittering object will be mistaken for the wind which we are searching. And then next factor is the subjective factor, where sometimes the habits and familiarity does influence the way in which we experience illusions. Now, as we have discussed illusions, let us see what are hallucinations. and there is a difference between illusions and hallucinations. Hallucinations come from Latin word which means to wander mentally. Hallucinations are distorted perceptions or perceptions of stimuli, which means there is absence of external stimulus that has characteristics of real interpretation of information. Hallucinations can occur in any sensory modalities such as auditory, visual, olfactory, tactile or gustatory. They are sensory experiences that appear real but are created by our mind and can affect all the above said senses. For example, you may hear a voice that no one else in the room can hear or see an image that is not real. It may involve hearing, seeing, feeling or even tasting things that are not real. Hallucinations occur frequently in people with psychiatric conditions including schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and sometimes we do not need to have mental illness to experience these hallucinations, but these are all abnormal perceptions. There are various types of hallucinations such as the first one, visual hallucinations. These involve seeing things that are not there and may be seeing objects or visual patterns, people or lights. For example, you might see a person who is not there in your room. Next, olfactory hallucinations. It involves sense of smell and you might smell an unpleasant odor when waking up in the middle of the night suddenly or feel that your body smells bad when in reality it does not. Then gustatory hallucinations. They are similar to olfactory hallucinations and involve the sense of taste. Instead of smell and the taste are often strange or unpleasant and relatively common among people with the epilepsy problem. Next, we have auditory hallucinations. These are among the most common type of hallucinations where a person might hear someone speaking to him or telling him to do certain things. Next, we have tactile hallucinations. It involves the feeling of touch or movement in your body. For example, the person might feel that some insect is crawling on his skin and can also imagine someone touching his or her body. As we have seen different kinds of hallucinations, let's talk about some of the causes of hallucinations. The number one cause is the mental health conditions. Under mental health conditions, hallucinations are most common in terms of people who have schizophrenia, dementia, delirium and others. Then the another cause is substance abuse. When people are too much indulged in substance abuse such as alcohol, drugs, etc., they may experience a bout of hallucinations. Then lack of sleep. Not getting enough sleep may also lead to hallucinations, and sometimes you may experience hallucinations just before you fall asleep, which is also known as hypnagogic hallucinations, and when this happens you suddenly get up or you will not be able to sleep. The next one is the medications. Certain medications which are taken for physical and mental health conditions may also cause hallucinations. And apart from this, there are other conditions. Some other conditions which can cause these hallucinations are high fevers, migraine, seizures, epilepsy, terminal illness, etc. So, these are all some of the causes why we hallucinate at times. Now, let us see another topic in perception called as extrasensory perception. Extrasensory perception without a base in sensory input. Bem and Honerton explained psi as unusual processes of information or energy transfer that are currently unexplained in terms of known physical or biological mechanisms. Parapsychologists who study psi and other paranormal events or events outside our normal experience or knowledge suggest there are actually several distinct forms of psi. The following are some of the extrasensory perceptions. The first one is precognition. It is the ability to foretell future events. For example, fortune tellers and psychics often make their living from supposed ability to make such predictions. The next we call it as clairvoyance. It is the ability to perceive objects or events that do not directly stimulate your sensory organs. For example, if someone is playing cards and they know which one will be dealt next, then they are experiencing this particular clairvoyance. Next is telepathy. This telepathy is a skill supposedly possessed by mind readers. It involves direct transmission of thoughts from one person to another or to the next. Next is psychokinesis. It is the ability to affect the physical world purely through thought. People who bend spoons or move objects with their mind or perform feats of levitation, that is making objects rise into the air, claim to have powers of psychokinesis. Students, let's summarize what we have learnt. Perceptions are the way by which we tend to interpret the information into meaningful chunks. Sometimes there might be distortions in perception in terms of experiencing illusions and hallucinations. Illusions are phenomena in which we tend to falsely interpret the perception. For example, sometimes we tend to perceive rope as snake. There are different types of illusions like Muller-Lyer illusion, moon illusion, Poggendorf illusion, etc. Another type of distortions in perception include hallucinations, where a person tends to perceive in the absence of stimuli such as hearing, voices, and even though there is no voice, or it could be that the person sees something in the absence of the stimuli, etc. Extrasensory perception is perception without a basis in sensory input. It includes the ability to foretell future, which we call it as precognition. The ability to perceive objects or events that do not directly stimulate sensory organs, which is called as clairvoyance. A skill where a person can read the mind, telepathy, and psychokinesis, where it is the ability to affect the physical world purely through thought.